There is no quarter for an anti-war movement in the United States and America except for on the right side of the aisle. It's been confirmed by the retraction of this letter.
No.
Until Vladimir Zelensky personally decides the war should be over, it's a blank check to Ukraine. People won't stand for that. People aren't standing for it, and people are going to the Republican Party as a consequence.
Everybody understands that this war has to end in a negotiated settlement.
So why is it so controversial for people to say that in a letter?
That's what I'm getting at, because it's this method of doing it. This is in America's interest to promote these people and this struggle.
I'm sorry, when I see someone like Matt flip-flop the way that he has done.
No, that is absolutely not true. Can I ask you, have you talked to any Ukrainians about this?
Yes.
Then you go to the end of the letter and it says, this is the primary aim of U.S. policy should be to end this war.
Should it not be? So let's take on this charge brought up midway and also at the end there that this is a letter that is urging a kind of colonial adventure that disregards the autonomy and of Ukraine and Ukrainians. You pointed to some section at the end of the letter, which you were referencing to make that point. And I want you to tell me where that was, because when I glanced at the end of the letter, here's what I read. We agree with the administration's perspective that it is not America's place to pressure Ukraine's government regarding sovereign decisions. And with the principle you have enunciated that there should be nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. That's a quote from Biden, I believe. Yeah. But as legislators responsible for the expenditure of tens of billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars and military assistance in the conflict, we believe such involvement in this war also creates a responsibility for the United States to seriously explore all possible avenues, including direct engagement with Russia, to reduce harm and support Ukraine in achieving a peaceful settlement. Mm-hmm. So help me understand why it is that billions of dollars of investment by America is not considered to be a colonial intervention or a large powers trying to influence an outcome in a conflict that is separate and apart from our own, but conditioning that money not a claim to withdraw the money, not a threat to do anything to stem the money, frankly, in this letter, but simply a conversation about wanting to facilitate negotiations instead of doing what the State Department has articulated, which is being willing to fight this with a blank check to the very last Ukrainian, apparently, despite the obvious military advantages of Russia as a nuclear power, which is what we were talking about last time you were on the show. Why is giving the money not about giving them billions of dollars of money, not interfering with Ukrainian independence, but conditioning that money on having peace negotiations, an imperial endeavor or colonial endeavor?
Right. So maybe it's helpful to think about it this way. France helped the American revolutionaries with money, troops, strategy, blockades in our war of independence against Britain. And that would give them a certain sort of buy-in or right to our revolution. But if they had come to Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and said, we're now going to negotiate an end to your revolution, we're going to negotiate directly with England, we would be outraged. But that's implied, and I believe explicitly stated in this letter. That's the part that's objectionable. And it's in the last paragraph that says we should, in conclusion, we urge you to, among other things, engage in direct talks with Russia.
Well, it says,
and that's what Jamie, go ahead.
I can read it for you. In conclusion, we urge you to make vigorous diplomatic efforts in support of a negotiated settlement and ceasefire, engage in direct talks with Russia, explore prospects for a new European security arrangement applicable to all parties that will allow for a sovereign and independent Ukraine, and in coordination with our Ukrainian partners, seek a rapid end to the conflict and reiterate this goal as America's chief priority. So help me understand then, Joe, because earlier you mentioned, rightly so, that there are open diplomatic channels. Lloyd Austin just spoke with his counterpart in Russia, and the critique has been that it shouldn't only be the Defense Department having direct negotiations with Russia. There should be diplomatic negotiations with Russia. So the fact that there being open channels seems to, undermine the idea that the channels are in fact the issue.
Right. Let's do two things here. One, let me go back to that first paragraph you quoted where you said they agree with the administration's perspective that it's not America's place to pressure Ukraine's government. Interesting point. Perspective rather than position. But then they state that. And then the second sentence produces that wonderful word, but, that then says, but we have this special responsibility because we're paying for this, right? And there's a certain logic to that. That's not untrue. But the two things are not connected. So the first sentence does not condition the second sentence. And as a result, what you see in this letter is that Ukraine's prerogatives are recognized, but they're placed in a subordinate position. They're secondary. That is, the U.S. will have direct talks with Russia and arrive at some kind of agreement towards a ceasefire and whatever a new European security arrangement is supposed to be. And then they will get the approval of Ukraine. So it does say we're not going to do this without Ukrainian approval. That's true. But they're then placed in a secondary position. That's what Jamie Raskin is talking about when he calls this a colonialist reflex, that we're the great power.
Help me understand this, though, Joe, because there's a world where someone says, you know what, this is none of our business. We shouldn't be influencing what happens in Ukraine. And therefore, we're not going to give them $80 billion and they can work out this conflict on their own. Why on earth is the United States of America, a country thousands of miles away with no relationship to Ukraine, which is not a NATO country? Why should it be involved in this conflict at all? The problem is, Joe, the willingness to accept the money. Take your analogy. If we are accepting money from France and France wants us to do something, negotiate a certain outcome to the Revolutionary War, et cetera, and we don't want to do it, we can easily say, all right, the choices are to, and again, this is not even what the letter contemplates. Right. The letter does not threaten any withdrawal of funds. But the vaguest suggestion that the people who are funding this war in large part should want to make sure that the war is coming to the quickest conclusion possible, and that is there's not an expectation that there's a limitless spigot of funding for them to continue to have a fight that they cannot win strategically all out warfare because of the asymmetry between the powers of these two countries. Why shouldn't it be the case that America makes it clear that there is going to be some end to the funding and that negotiations, good faith negotiations, should be a part of the active goal here? Yeah.
Well, there are, of course, limits on our funding and our involvement with Ukraine. And the president has made this very clear. And I think Biden deserves a lot of credit for giving enormous aid to Ukraine, but not doing anything that escalates the conflict. And that's why he's putting limits on the kinds of weapons that Ukraine gets, particularly the range of these weapons. He doesn't want Ukraine to be hitting targets in Russia, which has the possibility of escalating the war. We're not committing U.S. troops to this, which of course would then make this a direct conflict. We're not giving them the fighter aircraft or the modern battle tanks that they want. So Biden's trying to do what we would call escalation control, support them, help them repel this illegal, brutal invasion and occupation, free their people from Russian occupation, but not escalate the war, not push Putin in such a way that he might, and this is the big fear, and of course it's reflected in this letter, that he might use nuclear weapons as he has repeatedly threatened to do. So yes, there are limits, and we have national security interests in this. What you're reflecting, I think, is the view of some people, and some of the people who were involved in promoting this letter and helping to draft it do believe that we have no business being in Ukraine, that we shouldn't be there.
So what is the rationale? Because this is the question that I asked Matt Duss immediately when the conflict emerged. What is this articulated rationale for America being involved in this conflict and spending $80 billion plus on this conflict, where that same money, dollar for dollar, if it was just about saving lives, how much money can America give to the cause of keeping people alive and ending human suffering around the world? You could cherry pick any number of ways to get engaged that also do not involve military engagement as opposed to humanitarian engagement. So what is the articulated rationale for why Ukraine?
I would give you three. And the first is sort of the geopolitical global order argument. You cannot allow a nation by force to change the boundaries of Europe. We haven't seen that since the end of World War II. And that's what Putin is doing. He's saying
Europe specifically, other countries can invade each other's borders?
No, we could go further. I mean, this is why the U.S. intervened when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1991. Same principle. You can't allow borders to be changed. Europe is particularly important to us because it's the core of our national security alliance system. It's It's our biggest partner in the world.
But
that's true for everybody.
And yet Ukraine is not actually a country that's involved in any mutualistic, defensive relationship.
Exactly. They're not part of NATO. We don't have a defense relationship. But then we have some security assurances we gave them when we helped them get rid of the nuclear weapons they inherited from the Soviet Union. So that's part of an assurance there. But no, they're not part. We don't have a formal defense relationship with them. But when they're invaded, no, that's number. So that's the big thing. I mean, that's what motivates most of the national support, particularly in the West. You don't want, because if he gets Ukraine, what's next? And believe me, the Baltic nations who are actually share a border with Russia are looking at that. It's why Finland just joined NATO, why Sweden ended 200 years of neutrality and joined. They are worried about, and so you might not be worried, but they are worried. That's a chicken and
the egg situation, because some people would argue that the Russian invasion is triggered in part by the significant expansion of NATO after a time when there were commitments made that this is a defensive treaty in response to the USSR, which no longer exists, but for some reason keeps getting closer and closer to Russia's border, despite assurances from the West that would not happen.
Right. And I was a critic of NATO expansion in the 1990s and then 2008 when they announced further expansion. And many of the people who helped draft or write this letter have that view. That exactly what you said. The West basically caused this war by provoking Putin. And
it's not just to diminish Putin's ultimate responsibility in this.
Right.
But this is the issue. There were people calling before the war started to stop basically thumbing your nose and putting out these provocative statements about Ukraine being allowed to join NATO and the other countries that have joined NATO as well. And said and warned that this was going to happen. And so it's not that Russia isn't responsible for its own actions, but at what point is the international community that poked the bear, as it were, how much can they be even trusted at this stage to actually push for negotiations when it seems like what they were doing was pushing for some kind of escalation in the first place?
Well, just to answer that one, you can trust negotiations, but everybody understands, that this war has to end in a negotiated settlement. That's how wars usually end, unless you
So why is it so controversial for people to say that in a letter?
That's what I'm getting at, because it's this method of doing it that what most people are talking about is Ukraine and Russia, with the assistance of outside countries, have to negotiate the deal themselves. That's the only way it works. And we have lots of countries who are offering their help. France, Turkey, others who are trying to intervene on this to get Putin. But here's the other reality. Neither Ukraine nor Russia want to negotiate right now. So how exactly do you do this? And so their solution is, the way you do this is you go over the Ukrainian head. So if you think that we shouldn't have been in this war in the first place, that we basically provoked this war, it's terrible. But we don't have vital national security interests. The Ukrainians don't want to negotiate. How do we do this? The U.S. should move in and cut a deal. That's the great power.
Well, let's talk about the negotiation aspect of this, because many people are concerned that, it was reported that back in, I believe it was May, I'm reading from Common Dreams now, Boris Johnson pressured Zelensky to ditch peace talks with Russia. There have been multiple statements from the State Department, one from Lloyd Austin that I just clicked away from. I'm trying to find it again. Okay. Saying around the similar time that following his visit to Ukraine with Anthony Blinken, said that he wanted to, quote, to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. There have been many statements made at this point about wanting to basically do regime change in Russia, which you can feel however you want to feel about Putin. I don't think that anybody here is going to be baking him a birthday cake anytime soon. But the reality is that seems to be the colonial effort from many people's perspective, and why there are so many people who feel like they don't have a political home now and are moving to the right, where there is some criticism of this approach, wanting there to be some kind of affirmation from the left that endless wars are not okay, and funding Ukraine not so that it can regain its territories and have peace, but so that it can weaken Russia, is not a goal that American and the American left in particular should be participating in.
I completely agree. That is exactly right. And I believe I understand the statements you're saying, but when you look at U.S. policy, that's not what we're doing. We have been very careful not to, with one slip of President Biden, not to imply that we're after this is a regime change war, because in the end,
a slip.
You know, when he put it at the end of his speech, why is this man remaining in power?
I know, but I'm pushing back at whether it's
I understand, but look at what we're doing. Just look at
to characterize it as a slip. You've got the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States all in concert saying that this is a regime change operation, and we're supposed to see that as
they're not saying that. I got to hold you back. They're not saying that. Weaken Russia, and how can this man stay in power are statements. But there is no indication whatsoever that the U.S. has a plan or is trying to or is advocating regime change.
Why not say that? Why not allow this letter to be said?
But you have to. Okay, so several things. Number one, you shouldn't conflate diplomacy and diplomatic efforts with this letter. There are lots of people working on diplomacy. I'm telling you, this is a very particular point of view from a very particular set of small groups that were pushing this, and it blew up in their face. They were making a run for influencing the Congressional Progressive Caucus and helping determine their foreign policy, and it exploded.
Let's talk about this idea, because it's come up now a couple of times that there are small groups here. The backdrop of this conversation is that there is actually a very large percentage of Americans, including many people who do not at all identify as Republicans, who are very frustrated when they see these aid packages going out the door with seemingly no obstruction or no problem to a country that most Americans can't find on a map. At the same time that we've just been told for 2 years, we can't have a child tax credit, we have to end extended unemployment benefits, we can't get comprehensive, any kind of real comprehensive healthcare relief. Biden is crowing about lowering Medicare prices for the elderly, and that's great for the elderly, but what about for the rest of us? I mean, this is the world that we're living in, high inflation rates, et cetera. But somehow the bills that are so easily passed are these ones to fight this country on the other side of the world, combined with the statements that I've read, and we disagree about how to characterize them, about how the plan seems to be not necessarily aimed at shortening the conflict, but weakening Russia. People across the board, large groups of people, are PO'd. So the question, and so much so, by the way, and we should play this clip, so much so that even very moderate establishment institutions like Pod Save America, even there you're having conversations being had.
You make the right point that what Biden's saying is, I won't negotiate around the settlement that Ukraine has to accept without them. That doesn't mean we don't have things to talk to the Russians about. It just means Biden's not going to sit there and say, well, maybe you can keep this part of Ukraine and not that part of Ukraine. That's not going to happen. But to your point, if you don't create any space for kind of debate in the center here around this policy, you know where all the concerns about the war are going to go? They're going to go to where Kevin McCarthy took it, right? Totally. Which is like, hey, I'm getting uncomfortable here. There's nuclear threats. Let's cut off the Ukrainians, right?
It's a lot of money.
So, to some of you, like some of the Ukraine stands on Twitter or whatever, who like just, pile on this stuff, you might be creating the outcome you don't want, because by punishing anybody who says, let's have diplomacy, the only alternative to your position, is where Kevin McCarthy's going, which is like, hey, let's cut these, where Tucker Carlson is, basically.
Or, where Elon Musk. I mean, there's clearly a void of people.
There's a void of discussion.
Elon Musk is filling it, or that guy David Sachs, some like idiot tech investor, right-wing goober is filling it. It's like, why don't we have the CPC, the progressive in the House fill it, or at least try.
Well, that would be a very healthy place to fill it.
I heard him on Wednesday. I wrote to him immediately. We have an exchange. I think he's wrong, but I understand. But he has a point. What you were saying is, look, the uproar of this letter shrinks the space for diplomacy. And that is unfortunate. And what these guys did really screwed up efforts to get real diplomacy. I mean, they messed this up. And it's true. It's going to make it more difficult to advance other more practical diplomatic plans.
How is this the fault? Help me understand. How is this the fault of people who wrote a letter that I feel like substantively you're still saying you agree with?
No. I do not agree with this letter. You're saying that this letter represents diplomacy. If you're against this letter, you're a warmonger. And believe me, I can't tell you how many people have said that on Twitter.
Those are my words, exactly.
I know those. I know.
But help me understand, Joe. Where in the letter?
This was terrible staff work, terrible analysis, terrible expert advice, not enough member oversight, and not to mention the release of it. You're criticizing, you're wanting your president of your own party to change the core of his national security strategy 2 days before an election. I mean, who does that?
Where in this letter is there an argument for Joe Biden to change his approach to Ukraine? Because what I read was a lot of...
Why would you send the letter if you don't want to change? What's the point of the letter if you're just complimenting him?
Because you want Joe Biden to clarify, which you've admitted here were inappropriate statements that give people the belief that he's into regime change, and you want him to open up space for a conversation on the left about how obviously we're pushing for diplomacy. Obviously, peace is the goal.
Just remind you that the members who wrote this letter, who signed it in June, objected to it being released. This is not a military-industrial complex who stepped on it. The members themselves wanted the letter pulled back. You know, that you got to remember this. Look at all the statements that they issued. Mark Pocan, is he a warmonger? He came out and criticized this immediately. Representative Jacob said, I would not have signed this letter today. Ro Khanna on CNN, who was defending the letter, said, no, it should not have been released. So you have to understand, this is not a fight between the forces of good and the warmongers who want to continue the war. This was a very stupid letter. It was dumbly done. And the people who wrote this are being discredited within their own groupings. Nobody's going to touch these people, which is really the catastrophe, because look at what the harm it's done to Jayapal, who's on a track to assume leadership.
I got to be honest, I don't give a fig what happens to Jayapal, because I think that she's a disastrous leader, and her throwing her staff under the bus it also shows an integrity lapse that I'm not really wild with.
I don't think you understand what the staff was doing here.
We'll come back.
They deserve a lot of blame here.
We'll come back to the staff issue, but I will say this. Having been in any kind of senior leadership position, I think it's very, very poor taste and in very poor form. But if your staff fails, it's because you failed to oversee them.
Can we get back to why we should be supporting Ukraine?
But wait a minute.
Okay, I'll wait. It's your show.
We can't come back to that. But I do want to come back. Since we're on the subject, I want to play the Ro Khanna clip.
California Congressman Ro Khanna is one of the Democrats who signed that letter and is still backing it. Congressman, what in the world happened here?
Let me tell you my position. I have voted for every package to arm Ukraine. I will continue to vote to arm Ukraine.
But what happened with this? Signed the letter, didn't sign the letter, it was a staffer. How does this happen?
I don't think the staff was to blame. I think the letter is common sense. We're going to stand with Ukraine, but at the same time, we're going to have diplomacy to try to end the war. You know who tweeted out that just today? Ambassador McFaul, who is one of the strongest advocates for standing with Ukraine. You know, people need to look at the history. When we armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, did President Reagan stop talking to the Russians? Absolutely not. One of the reasons we got the withdrawal of the Russians is we continued to negotiate. When we had the height of the Cold War, did our senior military stop talking to the Russian military? Absolutely not. These people on Twitter, have they spoken to General Dunford? Because I have. Have they spoken to Admiral Mullen? Have they spoken to the senior military leaders? They have no idea what they're talking about. I'm on the Armed Services Committee.
Here's why fundamentally there is, I think, a real credibility issue when people say that, oh, it was just a timing issue. It's a staffing issue. It's an administrative issue. Because here's the thing. People like Matt Duss, Bernie's former foreign policy advisor, the day the letter comes out, tweets, this is a good letter.
Yes.
Backs the administration's continuing support for Ukraine, urges more aggressive U.S. diplomatic effort to identify possible ceasefire options while making clear no agreement will be made without Ukraine.
Yes.
And then completely turns it around
about this.
Completely turns it around the following day and says that this letter is a mistake. So for many people watching, it doesn't seem like it's an organic, oh gosh, immediately, like this was timed wrongly and they should have updated this sentence and that sentence to more accurately reflect what's happening on the ground now in the region. But all in all, the sentiments are still on good footing. What it feels like is that a call came down from on high and people were told they were going to get in big trouble if they stood behind it. And then the rats went fleeing. Tell me why I'm wrong.
Have you talked to anybody on Capitol Hill about this?
I have.
Okay.
I have.
The phone started ringing off the hook from the people who signed it. You have to understand, this is the number one rule of staff. You do not blindside your member. And they were blindsided. They had no idea this thing was going on. They forgot about it.
But Joe, is the objection, hey, can you edit? Can you reissue? This is what they could have done. They could have reissued a version of the letter that updated some of the stuff about the military status on the ground.
They could have, but they didn't. I mean, nobody saw it. Right. So before they released this, the staff felt that they had everybody sign off because they'd signed it in June. And so they were ready to go. And they never brought it back to the members.
No. I'm saying after people objected.
Oh, yes.
Instead of issuing a retraction, they could have issued an updated letter that still made the point.
So she issued a clarification on Monday morning and then another clarification on Monday afternoon. But it was clear you had to staunch the bleeding. I mean, it was a terrible message. And you can see
the bleeding. It made it worse, Joe. It made it worse because now there's confirmation that the right, and now the right is doing a victory lap, that there is no quarter for an anti-war movement in the United States and America except for on the right side of the aisle. It's been confirmed by the retraction of this letter.
No, you see, that's what I mean. You're identifying this letter with the entire anti-war movement. Did the entire anti-war movement sign up on this? Did they agree to these terms? No. There's a big peace movement in the United States. You want a genuine peace. And this is not a rejection of diplomacy. It's a rejection of dumb diplomacy.
It's the Democratic Party's repudiation of that anti-war movement.
No, it is not at all. In fact, look at the front page of the Washington Post today, the day we're recording this. There's a big story about allies are now questioning American staying power on support for Ukraine. Why? 2 reasons. One, the MAGA movement. They don't want to support this. The Republicans, 53 Republicans voted against aid to Ukraine. Kevin McCarthy is saying if he's elected House Speaker, we're going to reconsider all our aid to Ukraine. And then the other thing they cite is this letter and the effort by only 30 members to force a change. And they're saying fissures are opening up, and they're right. And this is true because the longer the war goes on and as the bills pay up, it is going to be more difficult to get Western support to maintain. And that's what Putin is counting on. Because this is why he doesn't want to negotiate now. He thinks he can crack Western support and Ukrainian support over a very rough winter, and he's been knocking out 1/3 of their electrical supply, so they freeze over the winter, and that he can outlast the West. That's what he's betting on, and the allies are a little worried about this. So this letter has done real damage to the united support that Ukraine has got. So why should we be supporting Ukraine at all? In addition to the security, the global security reason of not wanting people to use force to change borders, there's a basic human rights reason. We do not abandon people who have been invaded by a fascist dictator, and that's what Putin is. We help them. We resist this. And here's finally the moral reason. Watch the new Frontline show that takes us behind Ukrainian occupied cities that have been recently liberated, and look at what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. People often talk about occupied territory, but this is occupied people. They have tortured and slaughtered and raped and deported hundreds of thousands. 1.5 million have been forcibly deported. They're stealing Ukrainian children. 500 just yesterday were shipped to Russia. And this is why we should be supporting them. We cannot allow this kind of evil to go unchecked, just on a basic moral reason. I mean, don't you agree with that?
I'm sorry, I don't. And here's why.
Why?
There are gangs that have overtaken Haiti. There is a cholera pandemic that was started by the UN. UN members raped Haitians. 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater. Should we go, due to the climate crisis, should we go and invade China because Uyghurs are in concentration camps? Tell me, articulate. And this is the question that I asked Matt Duss when this war first started. Until you can articulate to me what the rationale is behind where America intervenes and where it doesn't, and give me some kind of moral accounting that makes me believe that it's actually about moral commitments and realizing how much of our money and our resources in the richest country in the world can go to saving lives and increasing the quality of life for the most people, as opposed to a strategic military intervention for territory, resources, and political control. If you can articulate to me why this is truly the most deserving humanitarian case on the planet, as opposed to a continuation of these Cold War policies We want our economic system, our oppressive, by the way, economic system to maintain global dominance, then I can start to entertain a conversation about what our intervention should be, how long, and how much. But there is nowhere in the entire public sphere that conversation is actually happening, and nowhere close to a rationalization that's been presented.
Got it. Let me give you two sources to go to that say this much more articulately than I do. The first is Jamie Raskin's letter, which I would like to print on parchment and hang on my wall, because it is a wonder. I'm sure I don't know if you've read it.
No, I've read the excerpts on.
I know,
but I haven't read it in full.
It talks about what Ukraine represents and the kind of society it's representing that's developing in the war, which is different from what Ukraine was before the war, and the inclusive nature of this, and then the kinds of people that are fighting this war and coming together for this war, and Ukraine is really a young, struggling democracy trying to stand up to an authoritarian, I would say, fascist power. And this is in America's interest to promote these people and this struggle. Timothy Snyder says something more elaborately in his Foreign Affairs article about the need for democracy to prevail over authoritarianism, and a victory for a democratic Ukraine and a defeat for Putin would be a huge victory for freedom, for human rights in the world today. So it's not just about Ukraine, although that's the primary reason we should be aiding them. They're the ones getting killed, raped, deported, and tortured. But it's also would be a tremendous advance for the cause of democracy, human rights, and freedom in the world, which has been under
That's what it is. The cause of democracy. The cause of democracy has been the excuse making for American imperialism. Look,
I agree with you, and that is the problem. We all, we're defending our freedom by going to Vietnam, really, by going to Iraq.
I look at Syrian children,
in this case,
and
it's true.
Yemenis and Haitians and Pakistanis, and I see humanity and a just struggle in each of those faces. And I got to tell you, it does bother me, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but when we saw all of the footage at the beginning of the war where reporter after reporter couldn't keep themselves from gushing over how blue-eyed and just like us these people looked, that part of this does have to do with the fact that it's a European country, and people feel like those lives matter more, and they're able to justify the war on that basis. Now, I don't think that's why we're there. I think we're there because we don't care about people at all, but because of our strategic global dominance that we're trying to maintain at the end of this flailing empire.
Right.
But again, I'm not making an argument that there isn't a case to go to Ukraine. I'm just saying nobody's made the relativistic case that I think is necessary to justify intervening here and not in a million other meritorious places. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.